The wind swept through Redemption Creek that morning, carrying dust and echoes of faraway bells. The town was half asleep, yet alive with the kind of tension that only came when the mail coach rolled in. Folks said letters were the closest thing to miracles the West ever saw, hope folded in paper, tied with dust in waiting hands. At the edge of the crowd stood Maeve O'Rourke, a woman who preferred the shadows. Her shawl was faded, her shoes worn thin, and her face carried the quiet kind of beauty most men missed unless they were paying attention. A pale scar traced her cheek. Not enough to ruin her, just enough to remind her what cruelty looked like. She'd buried her husband 2 winters ago, a man mean enough to leave bruises that time still refused to erase. The townsfolk pitied her in whispers, calling her the poor widow as if sorrow were a name that could stick forever. She didn't believe in much anymore. Not in luck, not in love. But one restless dawn, before the sun could scold her doubts away, she picked up a stub of a pencil and wrote a letter. Her words were simple, almost trembling. "Sir, I don't have beauty or fortune. I have 2 good hands, a heart that's still learning to trust, and a wish to belong somewhere that isn't cruel." She sent it to a rancher whose notice she'd read in the mercantile window. Honest man seeks honest wife. Pretty is optional. Must be willing to work and be worked with. It felt foolish to hope. But that night she prayed anyway, the first time she'd done so in years. Weeks passed. Then one morning, as she gathered her courage for another day of nothing, the postmaster called her name. "Miss O'Rourke!" "Letter for you." The envelope was thick, the handwriting plain and steady. Her heart stumbled as she read. "Ma'am, I ain't one for fancy talk. I mend fences, not promises. I don't need pretty, I need steady. Your letter sounded steady. I'll meet you at Redemption Depot, first Monday after harvest. I'll bring coffee. You'll know me by the black hat and the habit of talking to myself. I'll be counting cattle. Signed, Eli McCall, Cooper's Draw Ranch." She read it twice, then again, tears softening the ink. For the first time in years, she smiled without fear. The first Monday after harvest came golden and still. Wagons creaked, horses stamped, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Maeve stood by the depot, her carpetbag small but full of all she had left. Each rider who passed made her heart climb her throat, until she saw him. Eli McCall was taller than she expected, rough as a fence post but with eyes kind enough to shame the sun. His black hat shaded a face shaped by work, not vanity. When he smiled, it wasn't because he needed to impress her. It was because he was glad she came. "Ma'am," he greeted, voice low and sure. "Sir," she answered, almost whispering. He poured coffee into 2 chipped enamel cups. The smell was bitter, but the moment was warm. After a long silence, she blurted softly, "I'm not pretty." He met her eyes without flinching. "That's fine," he said. "I need honest, not fancy." The words hung in the air, heavier than truth, lighter than mercy. For the first time since her scar healed, Maeve felt seen, not pitied, not judged, just seen. As the sun fell behind the ridge and the wind cooled the earth, Maeve realized something small but certain. Maybe love in the West didn't come wrapped in lace or promises. Maybe it came in plain letters with black hats and coffee cups, and the kind of man who knew that beauty fades but honesty doesn't. And so began her story, not of escape, but of return. The road to Cooper's Draw was rough enough to shake the truth out of a liar. Red dust rose behind their wagon in long ribbons, the smell of sage and horse sweat filling the air. Maeve sat beside Eli, hands folded tight around her shawl. She'd expected awkward silence, but what she got was a kind of peace. The quiet of 2 people who didn't need to fill every space with words. They reached the ranch near sundown. The land stretched wide and wild, framed by cottonwoods and broken fences. The house wasn't much. 2 rooms, a lean-to kitchen, and a porch that creaked like an old hymn. But it stood solid, and to Maeve that was enough. "It ain't fancy," Eli said, helping her down from the wagon. "Good," she replied softly. "Neither am I." He smiled at that, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. He carried her small trunk inside, setting it near the hearth. The air smelled of pine smoke and leather. On the mantel sat a photograph, a woman and a little boy, both smiling. Maeve froze. Eli noticed. His face tightened. That was my wife. And our boy, Caleb. I see, she whispered. They got caught in the fever 3 winters ago. After that, I stopped talking much. Stopped hoping, too. He took a breath, steadying himself. But a man can't live on ghosts. Figured if I didn't try to start again, I'd end up buried next to them sooner than I should. Maeve nodded, her heart aching in silent recognition. Then maybe we're both trying to start again. The first weeks were slow, awkward at times. Maeve cooked, cleaned, and learned how to mend fences alongside Eli. She wasn't strong, but she was steady. He wasn't talkative, but he was kind. At night, they'd share supper and the kind of conversation that built trust. Slow, honest, unhurried. She noticed things about him. How he always checked the gate twice before sundown. How he murmured to the horses as if they were kin. How his silence wasn't cold, just careful. He, in turn, noticed her, too. The way she hummed while kneading dough. How her scar caught the light like silver. How she faced storms with quiet defiance. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled over the plains. Lightning flashed like torn silk across the sky. The cattle spooked, and Eli ran out to steady them. Maeve followed, stubborn as the rain. "Stay inside," he shouted. "I can help," she yelled back, clutching her shawl against the wind. Together they worked through the chaos, ropes, mud, and thunder surrounding them. When the last calf was safe, Eli looked at her, soaked to the bone. Hair plastered to her cheeks. "You're out of your mind," he said, half laughing. "So are you," she answered. Breathless, in that wild moment, thunder roaring, rain streaming down. He saw her not as broken or small, but alive, fierce, and real. He'd buried love once, but now standing before him was something different. Not the sweet bloom of youth, but the strong root that survives the storm. Later, by the fire, she whispered, "You shouldn't have to carry so much alone." He stared at the flames for a long time. "And you shouldn't have to hide from the mirror." Their eyes met, and something fragile but powerful passed between them. A promise not spoken, but felt outside. The storm drifted toward the horizon, leaving behind clean air and the smell of wet earth. Inside, for the first time, Maeve felt warmth that didn't come from the fire. The west was still harsh. Tomorrow would bring work, dust, and silence again. But tonight, 2 broken souls sat side by side, not needing beauty or perfection, only truth, and the quiet grace of being seen. The days at Cooper's Draw Ranch grew into rhythm, steady, quiet, and strangely comforting. Mornings began with the rooster's stubborn cry and the smell of coffee Maeve brewed before dawn. She'd step onto the porch, wrap her shawl tight, and watch the sunlight climb over the ridge like a promise. Eli would already be out there, tightening fences or breaking a young horse to saddle. They didn't speak much in those early hours, but they didn't need to. Some silences feel like prayer, yet in the West, peace never stays untested. It started with whispers, thin as smoke, carried by passing wagons. Redemption Creek had a way of talking about people who didn't ask to be talked about. A widow living with a man she wasn't married to? Tongues wagged faster than church bells on Sunday. When Maeve rode into town one afternoon to buy sugar and flour, she felt their eyes before she saw them. Mrs. Calloway, the blacksmith's wife, lowered her voice mid-laugh. Old Mr. Griggs stopped sweeping his porch to stare. Even the store clerk, kind enough in other times, couldn't meet her eyes. "Heard you're helping out at Cooper's Draw," he said lightly, weighing her sack of sugar. "I am," she answered. "Good man, Eli," he went on. "Hard worker. Folks just, well, they notice things, you know?" She smiled faintly. They always do, on the ride home. The sun dipped behind the hills, and for the first time in months, Maeve felt that old heaviness press against her chest, the feeling of being judged, measured, and found wanting. By the time she reached the ranch, the sky had turned copper and blue. Eli was waiting by the corral, hat tipped back, face shadowed with concern. "You all right?" "Folks talk," she said quietly, dismounting. "They think I shouldn't be here." He studied her for a moment, jaw tight. "You want to leave?" She looked at him. The man who never promised her more than honesty, who treated her like she belonged, who never once looked at her scar as something to pity. "No," she said. "I just don't want to shame you." He stepped closer, the twilight wrapping them both in amber light. "Maeve," he said softly, "this ranch don't run on what people think. It runs on truth and grit. You've got both. That's more than most folks'll ever have." She swallowed the tears she hadn't planned on crying. "But people can be cruel." "So can storms," he said. "But they pass. We'll stand through this one, too." For a long moment, they just stood there, close enough to hear each other breathe, far enough to keep the fragile peace they were still building. Days later, something unexpected happened. Eli came in from town carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper. "Got you something," he said awkwardly. Inside was a simple silver ring, thin, unpolished, but shining all the same. "Thought maybe it's time we give those tongues something else to talk about," he said with a grin. She stared at it, her hands trembling. "Are you sure?" he nodded. "You're the only thing that's made this place feel like home again." The wind sighed across the prairie. She smiled through tears as he slipped the ring on her finger. No church, no preacher, just the sky as witness. Later that night, they sat on the porch, watching the stars bloom like flowers across the dark. Maeve leaned her head on his shoulder. "I used to think love was something you had to earn," she whispered. Eli chuckled softly. "Nah, it's just something you keep showing up for, and in that quiet—" The world seemed to exhale, not with fireworks or grand promises, but with the steady peace of two hearts that had finally stopped running. Tomorrow, the gossip would continue. The West didn't change for anyone. But for Maeve O'Rourke and Eli McCall, Redemption Creek no longer felt like a place of judgment. It felt, for the first time, like home. The autumn came fierce and early that year. The mornings turned silver with frost, the air sharp as a knife's edge. Maeve learned the rhythm of ranch life, milking before dawn, feeding stock, sewing by lamplight when her fingers ached. She had never known such hard work nor such quiet contentment. The land was harsh, but it was honest, just like the man she had chosen. Eli had changed, too. The lines around his eyes softened. He laughed more, spoke a little easier. Some evenings, they'd share coffee on the porch, listening to the coyotes sing under the moon. It wasn't romance like in the dime novels, and no poetry, no fancy declarations. It was deeper, real, built from sweat, silence, and shared burdens. But the West has a way of testing what it gives. One cold dawn, a rider from the neighboring ranch arrived in a rush, breathless, his horse slick with foam. "Fire!" he gasped. Lightning struck the northern ridge last night. "The wind's pushing it straight for Cooper's Draw." Eli was already saddling his horse before the man finished speaking. "Get water wagons ready," he ordered. "Maeve, stay inside." "No," she said firmly, grabbing a wet cloth to cover her mouth. "I'm not watching you fight alone." By mid-morning, the world had turned red. Smoke billowed across the sky, the air thick and choking. Maeve and Eli worked side by side, beating back flames with wet burlap, driving cattle toward the creek. Sparks burned holes in her dress. Ash clung to her hair, but she didn't stop. Every time she faltered, Eli's voice cut through the roar. Steady, commanding, alive. The fire burned for hours, swallowing acres of dry grass. By dusk, it finally broke against the creek. Eli collapsed to his knees, coughing, his face blackened with soot. Maeve knelt beside him, hands trembling as she touched his shoulder. "We did it!" he rasped, half laughing. "No," she whispered, smiling through tears. "You did." "We," he corrected, voice soft as smoke. When the last embers cooled, they walked the blackened field together. The land was scarred but alive, much like them. The barn was gone, the fences half burned, but the house still stood. That night, Maeve sat by Eli's side as he cleaned his burns. The lamplight painted his face gold. "I thought I'd lost you," she said quietly. He looked at her hand, tracing the small silver ring still shining beneath the soot. "Takes more than fire to scare me off," he said. "Besides, you'd just come drag me back." She laughed, a sound she hadn't made in years. "You're probably right." Winter followed, cruel and unrelenting. With their barn gone, every day became a battle to keep the animals alive. Eli worked from dawn till dark, and Maeve matched him step for step. They hauled feed through snow, patched what they could, prayed the rest would hold. One bitter night, with wind howling like a pack of wolves, Maeve woke to the sound of coughing. Eli was sitting by the hearth, pale and sweating. "It's nothing," he muttered, waving her off. But by morning he could barely stand. Fever burned him like the summer fire had. Maeve did what she could. Cool cloths, willow bark tea, whispered prayers. She refused to leave his side. For 3 nights she fought to keep him alive. On the 4th, the fever broke. He woke weak but smiling. "You stayed," he murmured. She brushed his hair back gently. "Where else would I go?" Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky was clear, the dawn pink and tender. Through the frost-bitten window, light spilled across the land, broken but still beautiful. Eli squeezed her hand. "We'll rebuild," he said. "We already have," she whispered. And in that moment, surrounded by ashes, cold, and silence, Maeve realized something she had never dared to believe before. That love, real love, isn't about what survives untouched. It's about what still stands after the fire. Spring returned to Cooper's draw like an apology. The snows melted slow, feeding the thirsty earth. Green shoots rose through blackened soil where fire had once raged. The land, stubborn and alive, refused to stay ruined, and so did they. Maeve stood on the porch one morning, watching the first foal of the season wobble to its feet. She smiled to herself, feeling the warmth of sunlight across her scarred cheek. The world looked softer now, not because it had changed, but because she had. Inside, Eli was mending a saddle strap, his movements patient. The fever had taken weight from him, left a hint of gray in his beard, but not even sickness could dull the steadiness in his eyes. When he caught her watching him, he grinned. "Don't just stand there, Maeve," he said. "Come see this colt. He's got your stubborn streak." She laughed and walked over, brushing her hand across his shoulder. "You call everything stubborn when it survives you. Then I guess I should start calling you that too." Their laughter filled the room, quiet, real, the kind that comes after too many storms. As the weeks passed, life settled into something almost peaceful. The fire's scars healed, fences were rebuilt, and the ranch once again hummed with the sound of work. Still, Maeve noticed things, the way Eli's cough lingered, how he sometimes stared too long at the horizon as if counting days instead of cattle. One evening, as the sun drowned in orange light, she found him sitting alone by the creek. His hat rested beside him, his hair wind-tossed. He looked tired in a way that scared her. "You're thinking too loud," she said softly, sitting beside him. He smiled faintly. "Maybe. Just thinking about how this place looked before you came. Empty even when it was full. And now it feels alive. Because you're here." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You make it sound like I saved you." He shook his head. "No, Maeve. You just reminded me that I wanted to be saved." They sat in silence, the creek whispering between stones. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried. But by midsummer, the cough returned. Stronger, deeper. Maeve begged him to see the doctor in town, but Eli brushed it off. "Ain't nothing but dust in the lungs," he'd say with a grin. Yet she could see it, the wear, the quiet struggle behind his eyes. When he finally collapsed in the barn, the world tilted. She shouted for help, rode for the doctor herself, the wind slicing her face as she pushed the horse harder than she ever had. By the time they returned, Eli was awake, weak, pale, but smiling. "You came back," he rasped. "Of course I did," she whispered, taking his hand. "You told me not to leave." The doctor stayed through the night, but they both knew the truth. The fire, the winters, the fever, they had all taken their toll. By dawn, Eli's breathing slowed. He turned to her, his voice thin as smoke. "Maeve," he said, "you remember that day at the depot?" "I remember everything," she said through tears. "You told me you weren't pretty." He paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You were wrong. You're the most beautiful thing that ever came to this broken place." Her heart broke in silence. She held his hand until it went still, her tears falling into the dust between them. When the sun rose, she buried him by the cottonwood tree that faced the hills, the spot he said always caught the best light. She built a simple wooden cross and carved one word beneath his name: honest. Seasons passed. Redemption Creek talked less now. The widow at Cooper's Draw became part of the land's story. Quiet, strong, unyielding. Every spring she planted wildflowers by his grave, and every evening she sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the world gold. Sometimes when the wind rustled the grass, she could almost hear his voice again, steady, calm, full of that same truth that first drew her to him. "I don't need fancy," it would whisper. "I just need you to keep living honest." And she did.